Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the last of this webinar series for 2024. Great to see the level of engagement from our Boardroom community. No series or sessions can go forward anymore without something in relation to AI, and I hope we're going to bring you something interesting and different in relation to our sessions this morning. We are recording this as we have recorded all previous sessions. So if you missed any of our previous Boardroom program sessions, you can go through our Deloitte Boardroom program webpage and pick those up and watch them at your pleasure. If you have any specific topics you'd like us to touch on in future webinar series, please do get in touch with me in relation to that. What we will do this morning is we'll have our sessions, and as per usual, you can pop your questions either named or anonymously into the Q&A box, and I can ask those at the end of the presentation. This morning, I'm joined by three of my Deloitte colleagues. Manny Adelecki, who's a partner who leads the delivery of AI and data services in Ireland. He's at the forefront of what's happening on the ground and working with many of Ireland's most advanced clients in relation to AI and data, and is working in relation to not only developing business cases, but is really doing transformations with clients using AI and data as the main driver for that. Also joined by Colin Melody, who's a director in our AI and data practice with over 10 years experience, supporting clients and giving them the right focus and supporting them in relation to how they work and maximize the return in relation to AI and data. Also to be joined by Laura Skelton, who's a senior manager in our trust practice. Recently the area of how to work and develop AI carefully in alignment with regulation and legal requirements has really come to the fore. And I think it would be fair to say that in terms of development of AI, it is making sure that privacy and data protection, DPIA and policy matters are thought about early in the development of AI, and not something that's latched on the end or delivers slowly in relation to the delay in relation to that. So with that, I will hand you over to Colin, who's going to bring you through a short presentation. And as I mentioned, if you have any questions, do stick them into the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll pick those up at the end. Colin, I'll hand over to you.
Morning. I actually think I'm going to be this other way around.
You're both Manny, so we can go ahead.
The segment, then Colin comes in. But look, we're both around for any Q&A at the end as well. So morning, everybody, and thanks, Colin. And as mentioned, Manny Adelecki is my name, partner here in our AI and data business, and working across a number of different client organizations around their AI journey. And as we'll go through in a couple of segments today, I think we'll do a bit of level setting to start with, in terms of just providing an overview. And look, just to apologize up front if a lot of people understand a lot of this concept and others that might not, that's absolutely fine. But look, ultimately we want to just do a bit of a level setting in terms of just what we're seeing in terms of the acceleration over the last couple of years, and then more importantly then Colin will talk through some of the key things that we would provide guidance on in terms of getting started, and how do you build some of those foundations around, I suppose, realizing your AI ambition. So maybe if we quickly jump into the next couple of pages then, and I'll just do one or two bits, I guess. A very simple thing that we do with some client organizations, sometimes they just ask a very simple question when we think about, what's real versus what's AI generated now. So, if we were looking at these pictures, and appreciate that we're in webinar format, but I would suspect if I was to ask, the audience which of these images or human generated artwork versus generative AI generated artwork, I think it'll be very hard to be able to distinguish which one is human generated and which one is actually AI generated. So maybe if we were to just quickly flick into the next slide, we'll see, as you can tell there, so the third one is actually the one that's AI generated as opposed to human generated. So again, if we were to look at those three pictures, and for anybody who's got an artistic bone in their body, I don't have one in mind. It's a very hard one to determine which one is actually done by a human and which one is AI generated. And we're seeing more and more of that in terms of how people are engaging in the workplace. And even in some cases now, we're starting to see some models where it's actually hard to distinguish whether you're communicating with a human versus an AI engine. I think that's just some kind of ideas to level set, and we'll do a little bit around the history of how we've got to this point as well. But these type of questions are always interesting to begin with. Next slide, please. You know, again, this is one that's probably more appropriate for my daughter, who's a huge Taylor Swift fan, in terms of trying to understand again, which one is actually real, generated lyrics versus ones that would be AI generated, and they all look quite similar now. I'm not sure is that saying a lot about Taylor Swift's talent or not so much, but again, how straightforward it is to replicate some of these types of ideas, and we've seen. I remember a couple of years ago, I would have seen things in the past where people would have had voiceovers of, I think, was it Christy Moore or something like that, singing Britney Spears, and it was very hard to actually understand if that was a real Christy Moore singing Britney Spears lyrics. So again, you can start to see how some of these and different modalities can be very much intertwined in terms of what's humanly possible versus what AI generated. And again, if we flick on, we can see very easily that easily for those who are Taylor Swift fans will be able to recognize the first one being the real lyrics versus the ones that would be AI generated. And maybe if we go into some of the historical points as well, then as we move on. Actually, maybe a final one. Actually, this is one that always catches me when you look at this, and they all look like they're actually real people. And back to my point around, you can start to see how AI can be quite creative, but also can be quite challenging in certain cases where, it's straightforward enough that we're seeing client organizations, especially say in the fraud space, where you can very easily use generative AI to basically create a human profile, give them what would look like a real profile picture, actually be able to allow them to interact based on how those models are trained. So you can imagine somebody in a customer service sort of a role where you're engaging with something that's actually human, sorry, not human generated, where this is a profile that can have an address, has a face, has a voice, has human features to some degree, essentially. So looking at these pictures, for example, it will be very probably not so shocking for a lot of people to realize none of these people are real, and that's probably the scary part of it all. That as much as they look real and they look like they've got a certain feature on certain professional type of background or whatever it is, they're all AI generated, which I find quite fascinating as well. So maybe if we go into the next couple of pages, just with again, not to bore people with history, and if we talk about AI as a concept, I suppose the last couple of years has been quite significant. It's significant in the sense of generative AI and ChatGPT coming out a couple of years back, where it's probably commoditizing what AI actually is. But if you look back, there's a lot more you can bring it back to. And, we go back as far as 97 here, but actually you can even go, further before that, where if people might think about something like for those who might be familiar with their history around I think there was a movie called, I think it was The Imitation Game, I think it was, where it would have kind of chronicled Alan Turing during the Second World War using the Enigma code actually to decipher some of the German communication during the World War. Again, a lot of the logics and algorithms behind that, you can nearly link it back to machine learning, which is again a key component of AI, and that's going back into the 40s, right? And if we look at 97 here, that was a big mainstream moment where IBM's Bluestream would have defeated the world chess champion. And again, at the time, everybody just thought this was going to be the next big thing, but actually probably didn't maybe move at the same level of pace as most people would have anticipated. But there's a number of different factors to that. One being just the compute power that's required to drive the volume and the scale probably just wasn't where it is today in 1997, for example. People's access to data. If you imagine, like, I think about 90% of the world's data has been generated in the last 5 to 6 years. So that's quite significant in terms of what that is. And then the ability to have the compute and the processing power and things like the emergence of the cloud and a number of those factors has really accelerated the AI journey over the last couple of years in particular. And you can see things like, your Siri on your phone, right through to things like Alexa, for example. But actually, the real driver around the whole generative AI concept is when ChatGPT launched in late 2022. And what that's essentially done in terms of disruption is the fact that it's actually, I would say commoditized a lot of these solutions. It's in the hands of the everyday person. I would have had an example about a year ago where a neighbor's kid would have actually used ChatGPT while studying for the Leaving Cert. And I would have been quite intrigued around that in terms of how that individual would have got on. And I think, he got like 580 points at the Leaving Cert. which I thought quite fast. Now, didn't use ChatGPT for all of it, but would have been quite helpful in terms of a lot of the history and the English and the poetry and the essays and things like that. And like, I didn't get 580 my leaving cert. I actually wished I had ChatGPT to do my own leaving cert. So I think it's been quite fascinating to see how a lot of that development is really working, and what generative AI has done is it's put it in the hands of everyday users. I think that's something that's quite disruptive in terms of the clients that we work with, because not only do business leaders want to see how this is going to impact their business, actually, a lot of businesses, customers, and employees expect this to be part of what they do now on a day-to-day basis. Like, we have graduates coming into our business all of the time who expect that they would have access to a number of these technologies and toolings to be able to be more productive and proactively, do what they need to do on a day-to-day basis. So I think that whole commoditization of the technology is something that's been accelerated in the last couple of years. And for, again, a lot of people that might not be aware, ChatGPT became the fastest adopted technology ever in the history of mankind. So I think, when you look at things like the mobile phone, would have taken about, I think, was it about 14 to 16 years or something to hit 100 million users. Even Facebook would have taken a good couple of years to hit that volume. The internet took about 6 or 7 years to hit 100 million plus users. ChatGPT would have done that in less than 2 months. So again, it's that pace of adoption and that accelerated adoption of the technology, something that's been quite significant over the last few years. Maybe to move on to the next slide in terms of just how we're seeing that evolve, and even looking back at the last year in particular. What's been quite interesting is actually this constant battle for supremacy, essentially, across the big hyperscalers and some of the biggest tech brands in the world, where everyone is constantly reintroducing their new models. And if we look at the OpenAI's GPT models and how that's evolved, I think the first version of that, when it came out in 2022, would have, a very simple way to describe it, I think it would have kind of scored in the 10th percentile of actually doing the bar exam in the US, for example. And when the third model came out a few months later, that would have scored in the 90th percentile. So you could imagine that pace of acceleration and development. And then you look at, Google with the likes of Gemini and Meta with their Llama models as well. I think what's quite interesting is those battles, the winners of that, and I'm a firm believer in that. The winners of that is actually the end users, because ultimately you have all of these different models. These are the big known ones. There's hundreds and thousands actually of not so big ones that are out there. A lot of them open source, a lot of them freely available that anybody can access whenever they want to use it. And I think that constant battle for supremacy is something that's really evolving in terms of how we interact. And I think for those that may have even followed what I know Elon Musk would have his detractors, but actually, if anybody followed his big event over the last couple of weeks in terms of some of the newer technologies and the newer solutions, all of those things are powered by AI, and some of those things would not have been possible, if it wasn't for some of the advancements and developments and the accelerated pace that some of these things are happening over the last couple of years as well. We might just jump into the next page. And if we look at how some of these technologies has evolved, and that chart on the right hand side will tell you things around the volumes and essentially the pace and how accelerated some of these models have developed over the last year in particular. Like, even going back as far as February and looking at the speed of how some of these models have been deployed, looking at Gemini 1.0 versus the most up-to-date version, and even the most latest version of GPT 4.0 with OpenAI. Now, what we often talk to clients about is it's phenomenal at this pace, and the volume, the processing power, the speed, and all that. But actually, what to always remember as well is this comes at a cost. And a lot of people, as much as you want to experiment with a lot of these technologies, there comes a point where you need to start to make that decision as to which is the most cost-effective model, because ultimately, just because something is as fast as you want it to be doesn't mean something slightly slower or slightly less powerful will not get you the same output. And from an end user point of view, if your experience is not really going to be significantly impacted, then there is no major need to have to go for essentially the sledgehammer to crack a nut analogy. Like, some of these models in terms of the cost per prompt, for example. So if you think of somebody as an end user, there's models that are available out there where the cost per prompt is about 10 cents. And then there's other ones that are more sophisticated where the cost per prompt is about $1.60. And when you think of it, in a lot of cases, actually, the prompts that would cost about 10 cents per prompt could actually give you the exact same output as something that would cost you $1.60. So it's a lot of those types of decisions that we see a lot of client organizations grappling with at the moment. And even something as simple as how much do you want to custom build your own solutions versus how much do you want to leverage, your existing platforms. And one of the key questions that we would ask a lot of client organizations around it, why custom build certain things if in some cases actually some of the stuff you're looking for is going to be pre-built into a lot of your existing solutions and assets as well. So, you look at your ERP solutions, whether that's an SAP or Oracle, a lot of them are advancing in terms of they're developing some of their own AI capabilities. Anybody that's on the Microsoft stack, for example, they're all developing their own capabilities as well. Obviously, Copilot is the big thing that Microsoft are pushing at the moment in terms of what it is. And you can start to look at that as to, somebody who might use an Excel or a Word document or PowerPoint on a day-to-day basis in terms of productivity. A lot of these will start to get a lot of AI and Gen AI solutions essentially embedded into them. And I think that pace and that acceleration means that, in a lot of cases, actually identifying the value and the real business case behind building or leveraging an AI solution becomes a very key leadership topic, and a challenge to have for a lot of your businesses as well. Not everything needs to be custom built. And I think that's probably a key takeaway that we tend to have for a lot of client organizations as well. Maybe quickly and just conscious of time. And again, not to bore people with details, this is just around the different modalities in terms of what Gen AI is. And I think maybe just one underlying thing here to highlight in terms of generative AI versus traditional AI. I suppose probably the biggest difference looking at generative AI is the ability to leverage a lot of existing data and content in multiple modalities, as you're seeing here on the page, to essentially generate new data in potentially different modalities as well, which I think can be quite interesting. So you nearly have people who would look at something like, I saw an interesting one recently where you can basically feed the information of a novel into something and actually use a prompt to basically generate what looks like a movie trailer with specific characters for something that might be a blockbuster movie. So actually, it might not be a movie that's out there. So you think of that, then you're taking in text, which is the modality of what the input is going to be, and you're generating an output, which is going to be a short video that gives you all these different characters in terms of images, in terms of what they would look like, voice in terms of what they might sound like, and then in terms of the concept of it. So I think that ability to be able to take in a lot of existing data and subsequently generate outputs in terms of all these different modalities. We have clients, for example, who would look at things like code, where you might have a lot of really old programming languages like COBOL and some of those old um, programming stack, and trying to convert some of those into much more modern, much more, I suppose, easy to find solutions with skill set in the market, like, generating Python code, for example, using old frameworks and different programming type languages. Again, these are just some simple ideas and examples. And I think when we talk about modalities, it's just for people to kind of recognize it's all these different shapes and forms around whether that's text, voice, image, code, audio, whatever it is, and the ability of generative AI. And some of these models being able to take in multiple different modalities, because if you look at the first instance of some of the older GPT models, it would have been very much narrow in terms of their views as to specific modalities to drive a prompt. Now it's a lot more open. Like I said, you can put in text and generate videos and voice and a number of those types of things as well. Might jump into the next page. And yeah, some very simple, straightforward misconceptions or myths that we try to work through with clients as well. One around the fact that it's going to make the need for humans completely irrelevant. And my counter to that is actually it's an enabler. I used the Microsoft Copilot example. It's called Copilot, not autopilot, is the way I would typically describe that, right? It's that ability that humans will coexist with a lot of these solutions. And if you think of a lot of the Gen AI type solutions as something that has a huge amount of knowledge, but not a lot of wisdom, I always see the humans bringing in the wisdom, and actually that ability to be able to drive what this would look like in terms of human in the loop is something that we talk about all the time. So not everything needs to be 100% autonomous, especially when you start to think about, and look, Laura will touch on some of the risks and the compliance around the regulation around this. I think having that human lens is something that I think should never completely go away, because ultimately it's very hard to completely replicate what humans need to do in terms of what they bring in. That whole idea around bringing in ethics and trust into something, because ultimately humans are more likely to interact with something that they feel is ethical and they can trust in terms of how it's working as well. Second one here around Gen AI and how it creates original content. Like I said, it's based on patterns from existing data. I'm conscious of time, so I'll quickly maybe move into the next couple of pages. And look, we're happy to take questions at the end. Then we've done a bit of a look back and looking forward. This is backed by some of our own research that we've been doing over the last while, and we refresh some of the research on an annual basis. Well, I think, one or two stats that I find quite interesting is the fact that, looking ahead in the next 3 years, really, when you're going to 2028, saying about 33% of customer interactions will invoke autonomous agents or digital avatars powered by Gen AI. That's only around the corner, and we're seeing more and more of that is, people will expect that actually what they're how they're engaging, how they're interacting. And if you think about that, then how do you build that personalization with an end user, whether that's somebody in the workforce or that's somebody, in terms of an external customer as well. And then it's always interesting back to the point around this being much more of an enabler as opposed to a replacement. It's, looking at a number of repetitive processes being completely automated by private domain specific LLMs in every industry. So this is not, biased towards one versus the other. This is something that we're seeing pretty much across all sectors in our client businesses as well at the moment. And then in the next 12 to 18 months, it's that point around, 4 in 5 of organizations will have or be using some kind of a Gen AI API or application by 2026. And I actually think, if we were to look at this in 6 months' time, I would be very shocked if that number wasn't above the 90% mark, just based on what we're seeing. It's rare that I'm engaged with clients at the moment who aren't looking to do something or currently doing something in terms of Gen AI. But I suppose the main thing to focus on is a huge amount of the investments at the moment. For the last couple of years has been more focused around the productivity and operational efficiency type of use cases. But actually, in the last probably 6 to 12 months, we're seeing a lot more around not just scaling those, but actually how do we build more on the customer experience type of ones. And that whole hyper personalization space is something that's actually driving a lot of conversation and demand and investments from a number of organizations at the moment as well. We might maybe jump ahead then, and just a very simple couple of pointers here, and I can hand over to Colin to bring through the next number of topics as well. So some of the market trends we're seeing around here, like I've said, moving from experimentation to scaling. So it's kind of gone beyond that whole what's this all about? How can we look at it to actually how can we do things bigger, better, and faster? And that seems to be the level of investment that we're seeing from a number of organizations at the moment. The next trend, back to the point around embedding these into functions and processes, like I said earlier, it's that initial investment around how do we do stuff better, that operational efficiency point. And also, I suppose part of the challenges around not looking too far outwards in the first sort of couple of years is the fact that a huge amount of the data and activity that's been done still is within the control of a lot of the organizations without having a huge amount of, I would say, customer or commercial sensitivity in terms of what needs to happen. So there's a little bit around investing upfront to build that bit of capability in-house that when you do start to point out towards a much more, I would say, commercially focused or customer facing type of solutions, there's a degree of capability being built and there's a degree of confidence in terms of what you need to do and how you do it as well. Then modernizing data related capabilities is an area of significant investment. We're seeing a huge amount of organizations move from a lot of investment in on-premise to cloud-based digital platforms. Again, that whole ability to try and modernize your data estate to be able to harness larger volumes of data and faster, more real time, and doing that in a much more dynamic manner is something we're seeing a huge amount of investment in. So again, back to the point around investment, not just on the data platform, but even things around security and beefing that up, because the more exposed you are in terms of some of those data points, the more you need to make sure that you've got that security armory in terms of, the level of internal investment of what needs to happen as well. And then data quality, quite significant. And then the next point around mitigating risk and preparing for regulation. And look, I'm not going to steal Laura's thunder, and she can touch on a lot of the development around regulation. But again, a huge amount of focus internally at the moment in organizations around how do we get ourselves ready for the EU's AI Act, and then how do we make sure that even when it does, as it comes into full effect, we stay compliant on an ongoing basis, and how we track that, because the more AI you're embedding, the more you need to make sure that you're building a lot of those frameworks around how those tools are being leveraged and deployed as well. And then I suppose the final one is that whole momentum around measuring value, right? And not all the value, and just to be very clear, not every single value around a lot of the Gen AI solutions can be as easily quantifiable as we would have been seeing maybe with traditional technology solutions in the past, where it's as straightforward as you invest X, you get Y back. It's not always that straightforward because, what do you, to give an example, we would have functions, for instance, where you've leveraged Gen AI to do certain things and it freed up a bit of capacity, but actually how organizations chooses to use some of that extra capacity is not a straightforward answer as to this is how much money I'm going to get back. There's a question around, are you letting your people do a lot more of the value add, more creative thinking, more creative type of work, or even as a time back boost an employee morale to actually allow them to do what they do better. So a lot of those kind of payback are not always as straightforward, but in some cases they're actually quite straightforward, where you can see, based on a certain level of customer interaction, you can drive revenue up by a certain amount, you can get your NPS scores up by a certain amount or whatever. So some of them are quantifiable, but actually sometimes the non-quantifiable ones can always be just as impactful as well. It's probably just maybe a key takeaway point. I think this is me, and I will hand over to my colleague Colin.
Thanks so much, Manny. Morning, everyone. Colin Melody. I'm a director in our AI and data team, and working very closely with Manny. So I'll just take a few minutes Manny's kind of set that scene around how organizations are thinking about adopting AI, all the benefits that can come from it. And I wanted to describe, maybe practically speaking, what are the types of things that you might need to think about in terms of adopting this type of capability, and talk through those at a high level. So we typically look at it from a strategy, people, process, data, and technology point of view, because these are key pillars that everybody needs to consider as you work through your AI journey. So thinking about the strategy and how you're going to coordinate and access it effectively, and I'll talk about it further in a few minutes. How you get your people ready to adopt that change, how are you communicating to them, how you're making sure that they're fluent. Laura, as we said, we'll talk in detail around the controls and the process in terms of risks, ethics, but importantly, the AI Act in particular as it is in force at the moment. And then I'll touch on data and technology as well as those foundational capabilities in terms of being able to adopt AI. So if you just go to the next one then, Ruth, so very much in terms of, as we think about your AI strategy, being very clear as to what you want to achieve from it, and how you want to get through in an aligned way with your existing IT and hopefully data strategies as well, but those being very much driven from your overall business strategy and those goals. So how are you making sure that it's going to drive value for you and not necessarily that it's something that people are pushing you to adopt, but it's not clear in terms of how are you going to drive that value and that real business case that needs to go against it. What's the route that you're going to work through in terms of embedding it through those kind of business capabilities or providing access to a language model to your teams? What are those critical areas that you want to focus on? And really, what is the area that you think is going to be of most value to you and your organization? And that could be very different even for those organizations in the same industry or in the same sector. It can be very different depending on the complexity of your organizational model, but also the data and the technology that's available to you. So because of this general capability that generative AI provides and AI provides, it can be very different in terms of the journey that different organizations are going on. So if you go on to the next slide then, Ruth. So if you think about some of those particular areas, when you think about that business case, and it can be hard to articulate the business case, but looking at the economic components of it, what are the costs, and trying to understand those, in particular variable costs, because you're into the cloud, you're into licensing costs for access to these models, running of GPUs, and as Manny alluded to earlier, the effort and time that goes against managing those systems. Are those technically viable within your organization? Have you moved to the cloud already? Do you have an associated cloud strategy that's going to allow you to access this capability? Have you thought about the data privacy aspects? And as I say, Laura will touch on this in a few minutes as well. What's your own risk appetite? There is associated risks with adopting AI, and have you considered those in terms of bias or ethics or otherwise in terms of adopting the capability? Does your teams have the capacity that's needed to implement and define these systems? And are you recognizing that actually the benefit is that you'll realize some capacity once you get it out the other end? And there are some great use cases that are simple and low-hanging fruit. Manny talked about earlier, adoption into the customer contact center. A really straightforward and simple one that we had identified last year was, as we looked at a particular contact center, we could see that even the process of how people captured the notes in relation to a particular call would take them nearly a minute at the end of the call just to decide this is what the call was about. These are the key actions I need to take out of it, and make that note for the next person to take up when they spoke to the client later. That takes about a minute out of a 5-minute call, but you can fully automate that very relatively simply with GPT capability, saving nearly 10 to 20% of your overall call time. So really thinking about those use cases and the different ways that you can save time and effort, and even reduce kind of non-effective use of people's time, and helping them think about higher value pieces of work. And then also thinking in terms of that business case, what's your competitive advantage as such against other organizations? So yeah, if you want to move on. I won't go into too much detail, but obviously making sure that you have strong sponsorship across the organization, and that comes with making sure that senior leaders are fluent in what AI is and what the capabilities exist, but then putting structures in place in terms of a set of people who can help implement it or adopt it across the organization. And in many cases, what we're seeing is organizations create what's called an AI working group and have good representation from across the stack. So it's not just a data and technology conversation. It's a people, data, technology, compliance, legal, risk, ethics, and everybody's at the table from day one, because it's thinking about how to deploy these in a ethics or data privacy by design capability, rather than trying to layer those things on after you've already made progress through your journey. If you go to the next one. And then thinking about, as I say, those use cases that are valuable to you. So, we saw a stat at the end of last year that something like 70% of use cases are thrown out, or there was proof of concepts are thrown out after being commenced, because they haven't been thought through in terms of actually what's the business case for them being valuable for the organization. So being considerate around what those use cases are, creating a chart similar to what's on the screen there in terms of what are those ones that are high priority and relatively low risk or high feasibility that you can access today. Thinking about those that are longer term priority, that you can put a structure and process in place, and what's going to drive real value, and then you build your strategic roadmap against those. If you go to the next one then. So when we think about people, there's probably two parts in terms of the people journey. One is, as I want to create or build these systems, do I have the right capabilities in-house? And that speaks a little bit to that kind of strategic ambition that I spoke about earlier, in terms of how much are you going to adopt, how much are you going to build, how much are you going to buy? What am I doing with the existing capabilities that many organizations have already, and how do I leverage that and augment it with the right types of skills to manage and monitor these tools? So, for example, everything from data scientists and data engineers, your typical business analysts, your machine learning capabilities, but then being very closely linked with existing business capability and platform engineers and so on. So have you thought about what that communication strategy is going to be as well for the organization? Have you thought about the fluency that needs to happen across your team so that they all know how to adopt it and why it needs to be or why it can be impactful to them? What are the core skills that, outside of those really technical skills that are kind of on the page, what skills do my team need to have to be able to adopt it effectively? Saw a stat from the US where they said that 70% of leaders would typically choose somebody who has AI capability, so as in they're able to use an AI system or a Gen AI system, over somebody more experienced, with the concept of, look, I know that they can access the kind of SME knowledge as long as they're able to have critical thinking skills, being able to use the capability in a particular way. And then also thinking about as those tasks or otherwise are automated within the organization, what supports are you putting in place for your teams in terms of either reskilling or being able to think objectively around this capability. I thought a nice way of it being phrased at an event we ran last week was one of the panelist speakers spoke about how as they thought about this journey, they realized, they'd been in the particular organization for 20 years, but what they did during that 20 years changed substantially. They were constantly evolving their role, constantly adopting new technologies and changing what they did on a day-to-day basis. So thinking about AI in the same way, this is an evolution of technology adoption in terms of your tasks that you do today will be different from what they will be in a year from now. But that's no different to what that journey would have been through your entire career as such. If you want to jump on to the next. So just thinking then around your operating model, I won't dwell into it conscious of time, but thinking about the different stages and the capability that you need at each of those stages, going from planning your capability to building your proof of concepts and your pilots, and then being able to implement them in a trustworthy way and the appropriate controls into your existing IT capabilities and kind of that operational functions. If you want to move on. I won't talk too much about data. Interestingly, when we spoke to a set of AI leaders a couple of weeks ago, one of the core things that they said as we looked at strategy, people, process, technology, and data, data and technology actually were the big places that they felt they were most exposed and had the most work to do. And this was back to kind of foundational pieces that had been described for many years in terms of having good data governance and ownership, having the data processing power, having good data security, but also layering elements on that are specific for AI and Gen AI. So some of those kind of outlined here in terms of understanding if there's bias within the data, understanding what your sensitivity or the model sensitivity to those inputs might be. Is the available data or the system that you're creating, is it going to be scalable? So you've done your proof of concept, or you're now going to be able to roll it out to the wider organization and those type of considerations. So lots of things on top of your kind of existing capability that need to be enhanced. And then finally, just talk a little bit about technology. So really, as kind of Manny alluded to earlier, in terms of having the ability to compute and the costs associated with that and the scale, but the normal things that you would expect in a modern data platform in terms of the data management capability, the automation technologies, the integration, and obviously that layer of, do you have the right people who are able to help manage and deliver, monitor, and evaluate your capabilities. In a lot of cases, it's simply looking at those particular use cases that are prioritized and understand, do you have the data and the technology to service those? And as you work through that as a proof of concept, you build your knowledge and you learn as you go. And that's what a lot of organizations are working through at the moment. And I suppose if you just jump to the last slide there, Ruth, thinking about that, what we see a lot of organizations do, and we'd advocate as a reasonable approach, is that as you work through that discovery and strategic process, you're moving into your first pilots and POCs, learning as you go through that process to know what the measures of success are, what are the pitfalls, what are the challenges that were unique to your own organization, and how to navigate those. As you think about how you scale, you're thinking about, do you have those foundational structures in place in order to gain the benefits that you really need? And then you're in a position to be able to industrialize and really drive value from this capability. The first ones are always hard. As with any journey, it's thinking about, do I have all of those capabilities in place? But it isn't to say that it's not achievable either, or something that you should shy away from until you have everything in place. These can be done and are done in small pockets, and you move yourself forward in a kind of stepwise way, learning as you go through that process. So I hope that gave some food for thought, and thank you for the time. And I might just hand over to Laura then, who'll talk a little bit around the overall implications of the AI Act in particular for organizations. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Skelton. I'm a senior manager on the Digital Trust and Privacy team. So I suppose working with Colin and Manny and Colin and our colleagues, we are very much driving the message that AI is about innovation hand in hand with compliance. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the compliance piece for the next few moments. So, as Manny and Colin have both referenced, the EU AI Act is now in effect as of August of this year. And why? So, one of these priorities is a Europe fit for the digital age. So, alongside over 10 significant digital regulations, such as the Digital Marketing Act, Digital Services Act, and the AI Act introduces a framework aimed at regulating the deployment and usage of AI within Europe. The Act is first and foremost a product safety regulation, as you can see from the left-hand side of the screen, but it also safeguards fundamental human rights such as privacy, non-discrimination, and fairness. Much like the GDPR, it adopts a risk-based approach, and it does that by categorizing AI systems based on their use cases. And then compliance requirements and obligations are established according to the risk level that an AI system might or may pose to individual users. The Act focuses on principles, which leaves it adaptable to as yet unknown iterations of AI technologies. So, as our AI capabilities develop, quite likely, in fact, certain that the AI Act will also develop. In saying that, as we stand, the legislation does contain many grey areas or areas that are yet to be kind of fully defined. It's expected that delegated and implementing acts, guidelines issued by EU institutes, so supervisory authorities, and then harmonised standards, for example, ISO, will support clarity of those grey areas. I suppose the last thing to say on this slide is that the Act is an extraterritorial regulation. That means that it affects all AI system operators, that's including public sector, private sector of all sizes and industries that are offering AI products or services on the European market. So effectively, if you're using AI in Europe, either as a provider or a deployer, the Act applies to you. Ruth, if we could jump to the next slide, please. So some of the things to talk to you about around the AI value chain. So responsibilities as defined within the Act vary based on the specific circumstances of each operator, if we can deem them that. And the rules and obligations differ depending on the type of role and use case involved. So you might mention or might remember from the last slide me speaking about grey areas within the Act. And while the Act outlines obligations, they will be further specified in the coming years through those delegated and implementing acts. It's really, really essential for businesses or for operators to identify their role and the relevant risk category that they're going to fit into. The two that we've displayed on the left of the screen here, providers and deployers, are probably going to be most relevant for the organizations on this call. Providers basically are defined as natural persons, public authorities, agencies, or other bodies, which we simplify to organizations that develop an AI system or a general purpose AI model, or has a system or model developed and placed on the market on their behalf. Deployers then are organizations using an AI system under their authority, so that's either internally to your employees or externally to your clients. What's really important for this slide to remember is that depending on the level of augmentation a deployer might make on an AI system, they actually may redefine themselves as a provider, and that includes transitioning into being obligated to fulfill the responsibilities associated with high risk and GPI as defined for providers under the Act. So I suppose to say there are distinct obligations depending on your role in the AI value chain. And I think one of the first things you should be doing in terms of compliance with the AI Act is deciding what your role is, depending on the various AI systems that you interact with in your organization. If we could move on to the next slide, Ruth, please. Okay, so apologies. So the AI Act focuses on how AI is used rather than the technology itself. So that means that the regulatory obligations increase as the risk levels increase for users. There's four specific user categories which are outlined in the triangle on the screen. At the top of your triangle are those systems that are deemed unethical or harmful, and they are prohibited as they pose unacceptable risk to people. The main focus of the Act, and sorry, what I should say when I mean the main focus is the most amount of regulatory obligations is your second segment, and that is high risk systems. There is increased compliance obligations on those technologies that are deemed as high risk. As the Act stands, the high risk applications, so use cases, are listed in Annex 3 of the Act. And also in Annex 1, which relates to safety components, which are already subject to EU standards. High-risk systems need to be assessed before they enter into the market, but also really important to remember for the entirety of their life cycle. As mentioned on the previous slide, the adaptable nature of the Act means that the list of high-risk applications is going to be subject to extension and frequent updates. So the AI Act listing use cases that are high risk, that list will be constantly updated and increased. Then if we moved down to the bottom of our pyramid, we talk about limited risk systems, which will, in fairness, be the majority of AI systems on the market. There are transparency obligations for that type of usage. So providers will have to ensure that that the AI generated content is identifiable. So you will have to be telling people, even if it's limited risk, that the content has been generated by AI. And then at the very bottom of our triangle, we talk about minimal risks. They are largely unregulated and free use is allowed. Organizations can choose to adopt a code of conduct to ensure the reliability of those AI systems. Just a word of caution on those minimal risk systems. It's not that they should be identified as minimal risk and forgotten about, because they may also fall under obligations of other EU regulation, such as the GDPR, and also then they will absolutely fall under your business and security risks. If we move to the next slide, Ruth, please, just conscious of time. So as I said at the top, the Act came into effect on the 2nd of August of this year, and there is now kind of a critical window for compliance. The first of those is going to be next February, where the ban on prohibited systems comes into effect. And then we've mapped out the various timelines that come into place, mainly around general purpose AI and high risk, until we go to August 2027, when the full Act will come into effect. Just to say about the bottom of the screen, and not to labour the penalty and fines piece, but the penalty regime is structured based on the nature of the violation, considering whether it involves acceptable risk, high risk, or GPA models, and then with fines increasing according to the risk category. So to simply put it, the higher the risk category, the higher the fine is likely to be. Member states are going to be responsible for establishing rules about penalties and ensuring their enforcement. So they will actually have the discretion to determine whether they use warnings or other non-monetary measures instead of fines. And they've also been guided by the EU that they must consider the particular interests of SMEs and startups. They are also mandated to assess the nature, gravity, and duration of each infringement, as well, interestingly, as whether the entity in question is a repeat offender, when determining the level of the fine. And I suppose the last thing to say on this slide is that the national supervisors will have the authority to forcibly remove non-compliant AI systems from the market. Ruth, if we could move to the next slide. So I suppose the Act's interplay with existing regulation is what we're hearing from clients, creating quite complex compliance challenges. And I suppose what we would be advising is that adopting a holistic strategy that leverages maybe the compliance frameworks and strategies that you have in place within your organization already. I think it's key, and I think Manny and Colin touched on this already. Collaboration, having the right people at the table from the outset when you are talking about AI adoption and implementation, having that real mind to the human in the loop. I think, Manny, when we spoke about this previously, you said something really interesting to me. The innovators should not be waiting for legal and risk and compliance folks to come and tell them what to do. And similarly, I think the legal and risk and compliance people shouldn't be chasing around the innovators and the tech people trying to find out what they want to do. This is about that whole trust by design, privacy by design, security by design from the outset, as Colin has alluded to, everyone being around the table talking about this from the get-go, and then that informing strategy for the senior leadership team and the board. If we flick then on, Ruth, to the last slide. I think just some key takeaways that we should be thinking about now. Number one, creating an AI inventory. What's in place in your organization now? Then, as I said at the top, identifying your role in the value chain. Then you need to look at determining the risk category of those AI systems within your inventory. And that's your first 3 steps on your road to developing your AI compliance framework. Just to point out in particular, Article 4 of the AI Act, which focuses on training and awareness. And sorry, Ruth, I think that's animated, so you might just need to hit it just one more time. Yes, oh, sorry, it comes all the way across. So I suppose the Act specifically calls out AI literacy and AI fluency, and that is at all levels of your organization, so at all lines of defense, from your operation, BAU, all the way up to your board and your exec, that they have the appropriate technical knowledge, experience, education and training, but also the context that AI systems are going to be used within your organizations. And that literacy is demonstrable. We know from GDPR compliance, everything with the supervisory authorities is about being able to demonstrate the good work you've done. And conscious we've only 4 minutes left, I will close off there.
That's great, Laura. Thank you very much. What I'll do is there's some questions in Q&A, which I'll come to now, but maybe Colin or Manny, one question that commonly comes up is in that incubation to industrialization piece, there's been a lot of excitement and a lot of people beavering away in relation to developing use cases. Where are you seeing business cases not stacking up or the gatekeepers stopping some of these use cases coming through? So what are the common pitfalls that our audience can avoid?
Yeah, one of the major kind of challenges we see actually is when organizations try to go from, back to your point, Collie, around a couple of use cases that's been proven to be relatively successful in an area, and then try to industrialize and deploy it as a live solution. And then we get a typical kind of query around, well, our risk and legal and compliance people are just, providing a roadblock. And we've actually seen that even internally from a Deloitte point of view, where when we launched Paired, one of the things that we had to make sure we did upfront was work through with our quality, risk and compliance team to make sure that as we deploy this solution across 70,000 users across Europe, that we had those people in the tent from the get-go. And I think the biggest thing that we would often say to clients is making sure that, as you kind of think about those AI use cases, there is the business value definition upfront. It's not just a bunch of the creative techie folks who are kind of trying to play with a few different new tools and new toys, because everybody has ideas, but actually somebody who can really challenge what the business value is going to be. And that value could be everything from efficiency to improve customer experience, even in some cases building capability in-house. There could be some of the value you're looking to generate, but then very quickly making sure that the risk, the compliance, the legal input is very much there from the get-go, that it's not something that you're sort of asking after the fact. And I often say that sometimes the most amazing tech people and your AI engineers and data scientists are probably the worst people when it comes to thinking about some of those ethical kind of considerations and some of those kind of questions around the risk and the compliance, and making sure that those frameworks are pretty much there, that it's an all everybody's, I suppose, responsibility is probably what I would say is as a good starting point. And it's asking those questions, not just on the business value, but making sure your legal, risk, ethics, compliance folks are very much involved from day zero, as opposed to waiting after the fact. That it almost feels like a one person builds and one person signs off. It needs to be we all build and sign off on the journey from the get-go.
Yeah. And I think to the question that's asked in the Q&A, who should manage AI? I suppose it depends what part of the business one's deploying it to, doesn't it? With good
Yeah.
oversight.
Yeah, and I think look, the way I often see it is AI is everybody's responsibility. Obviously we see a lot of clients who are now building AI centers of excellence, or people now appointing heads of AI in organization. Absolutely, but it's no difference to saying, there is a CFO in an organization, but actually the accuracy of financial statements is not just down to the CFO. There is a responsibility on all the people who are providing that data point. So AI is no different in that sense. I see it as you're working with data. It's everybody's responsibility to feel a degree of ownership, because that's the only way you would kind of tackle that point. Absolutely, there will be people who are accountable for owning a function or being in a leadership role, but actually it's everybody's responsibility.
Okay, with a minute to go, thank you very much to my speakers. Thank you very much to everyone who joined us. The slides will be available. They'll be on our board program, and people can listen back, or if you'd like to share the link to others, they can join us for further sessions. But with that, have a very safe and happy Monday afternoon. Thank you for joining. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.